Hello, everyone, and welcome to EV Nickel's live event. I'm pleased to introduce their president and CEO, Sean Samson, and VP of Exploration, Mr. Paul Davis. They'll be going through a brief presentation followed by a Q&A session. So you can submit your questions on the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen at any point during the presentation. As always, this summit is being recorded and will be available on six.com to watch afterwards. So without further ado, I'll kick things over to you, Sean, to start.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks everybody for joining. We have some really exciting news today. We're going to take the opportunity to get folks up to speed on the story generally for anybody who may be new to EV Nickel, and then try to get into some deeper detail about the news releases we've had over the past week or so, specifically focused on where we are with the R&D, the Clean Nickel R&D. So it's exciting material. Let's get right into it. So we're going to be talking about the future. So think about the sort of legal consideration. You can see that in more detail on our website. This presentation will be posted on our website as well. So let's start with what we have. The investment case for EV Nickel now is built off of the situation the world is in, where nickel is integral to electric vehicle batteries. So it's a bit of an alphabet soup, the different battery chemistries that are coming out, but quite consistently, they are nickel intensive. The energy density of nickel wins through, it seems, in the EV chemistries. And the really interesting thing is that right now, car companies are making significant investments to pivot their lines over from internal combustion to EVs, and with today's winning chemistry. So those car companies are making those decisions, investing the capex in their own plants. They need to source nickel to feed those plants going forward. So bigger picture, and I won't get much into the macro today, but as compared to last year's production, they think 3 million more tons of nickel is required by 2035. 3 million tons is a big, big number. So from the perspective of Ontario, that's almost 50 more Sudburys, which is staggering. So really what it means, if you take a step back, it's that almost every large deposit that is currently on the books, it's sort of like the world needs that to get into production. So that's the backdrop, the situation we have. There's a couple big complications, though, about this global challenge. One is that all nickel is not equal. So now the new demand is requiring more of the suppliers. So carbon cost is a huge new consideration in the nickel space. So it's not just a function of finding the nickel units for this new demand. It needs to have the lowest possible carbon cost. And I've spent a lot of time speaking publicly about the new disclosure requirements in Europe starting next year is a big game changer. So carbon cost is now huge. And then, of course, as well, geopolitics. At its simplest, you have the third biggest producer in the world, Russia. Western companies can't talk to Russia. So that's a huge amount of supply off the board for these car companies and their battery suppliers who are trying to find nickel. Then the two largest producers in the world, Indonesia and the Philippines, are significantly influenced by the Chinese. And pick up any newspaper and you see one of the big articles of the day is about nearshoring. And as the world becomes a smaller place and there is policy in place trying to incent domestic production, that's really changing the game here in the global nickel space. And then that next point is that governments are all trying to play in this nearshoring phenomenon. And they're in what I would refer to as a bit of an arms race to try to subsidize their domestic supply chains. We step right into that because our strategy with the Clean Nickel, where we're spending our time today, plays in very nicely to everything that the province of Ontario, where we're located, and the feds want to be happening. So what we have is a huge land package just outside Timmins. This is, we think, the best permitting jurisdiction. We're fed by hydropower, which is wonderful from a carbon perspective. We have now 2 tracks for potential development. We have resources in place on both our high-grade W4. Before the summer, we came out with a huge expanded resource on W4. It's exciting high-grade mineralization. within distance of surface that ordinarily gets turned into a mine. And then we've got the large scale with the Carlang, which is enormous. So we're excited to have, in a way, that exploration risk behind us with those two resources on the board. Then the other work we're doing is around R&D for the clean nickel. That's our trademarked term. That's going to be the focus of today's discussion. And that's us trying to get the lowest possible carbon cost for the nickel we produce. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about valuation today, but when you look at what we're trading for and what we have, it's pretty staggering how we compare to other potential nickel investment opportunities. So that's our investment case all wrapped up. Kyle, if we can jump to the next slide. So here's what we've got. We are just outside Timmins, and our land package, that 30,000 hectares, is the yellow there. We have, as I was saying, the high grade and the large scale track there on the eastern side of our land package. It's an historic production area. So we got the crossed hammers there. Those are mines that in the past have produced nickel. Importantly, what we have as well on what we call the Shaw Dome, this geologic district that we control so much of, is our neighbors, a privately held company, have another high-grade deposit called the Heart. And that same company have a small permitted mill called the Redstone, which is operating now. So that's our land package. Go to the next slide, if you could, Kyle. Here it is, Google Earth. We are within 30 kilometers of Timmins. So we have basically a suburban mine opportunity here. The Shaw Dome project is so close to town. It's a wonderful place to have discovered a huge amount of nickel in our large scale and also high-grade undeveloped nickel with our W4. Next slide, Kyle. So here's very quickly about our cap structure. One of the interesting things which should appeal and may have drawn in a bunch of participants in today's call is the deep value that we represent. So on the left has been sort of the story of Paul and my last couple of years. We've had a bit of a ski slope in terms of our share price. And it's really interesting to overlay on that chart what we've been doing. So we've had significant discoveries and the market has not responded much at all. We had news in September of closing a $2 million financing with new strategic investors. That's exciting. That's going to be a huge part of our story going forward because we really think that's a differentiator. I'm not going to speak much about that today, but I'd really encourage, especially new people to the story, to take a look at our news release about our $2 million financing and take a look at who those people were. So we trade down at 6 cents. Go back up. And we've got a bunch of cash in the bank, and we trade equity value-wise, market cap of about $5 million. Now, if I just quickly run through sort of what we have done over the past couple of years, 2021, we spun the W4 out from Rogue Resources, and we IPO'd at the end of that year. Next slide, Kyle. Then last year, 2022, was really about growing the land package. We did a transaction to triple how much land we had up in the Shaw Dome. We launched what we're talking about today, the Clean Nickel strategy. We signed a ROFR for the Carshaw Mill. That's another mothballed mill up on the Shaw Dome. Sort of gives us a bit more optionality. And then we made discoveries. We made the discovery of the high grade going deeper with the new Carlang and the A zone specifically, the first 20% of the Carlang. And then we made a discovery to our south at Groves. Next slide, Kyle. And then what those were is we came out with resources the first half of this year. That's the billion-ton resource on the A zone at Carlang. And that's really just the first 20%, which is really interesting. PDAC this year, we announced a significant investment, non-dilutive funding towards the R&D. That's really the results we're talking about today were from that investment. So we've got huge support from government. And then just before summer, we announced our W4 resource, which was more than doubling what we had historically there. And that got us over 43 million pounds of almost 1%, all within 400 meters of surface. So as we've said, that's the kind of mineralization that often gets turned into mines. So it's really exciting to have those resources and their exploration risk behind us. Our news with the financing in September, again, I'd encourage folks to take a look at that news release. We brought in and aligned ourselves with new strategic investors. So if we look going forward, we said that we're going to come out with some R&D results. That's been the news releases last week and then today. That's what we're going to talk a bit more about in detail around the tank bioleach and the carbon mineralization. And after this, later this year, we're going to talk about the broader project concept, what we have in mind for the Shaw Dome. And once we have that, we're going to talk a bit more and give more clarity to investors and out into the community about where we plan to go with permitting and studies and show that pathway for how we'll attempt to advance the Shaw Dome. So let's hand off now. Paul, if you want to get us into some detail, setting us up on these two clean nickel areas, first around the bioleach, and if you could just set us up sort of what this all means. And again, this is from last week's news release.
Sure. No problem, Sean. Let's give a little bit of history on the refining of nickel and copper from Ontario and throughout the world. It started out really as a similar smelting and refining process. And what they do is they burn off the sulfur. Back before, let's say, 1900, they would just pile the ore on top of trees, burn the trees, burn off the sulfur, releasing all of this sulfur dioxide and other pollutants into the air. They've transitioned that now into a flash furnace, but it's really a very similar process. They're taking ground up ore, pumping it into a furnace with air and burning off all of the sulfur. So that's where you see that chemical formula generate sulfuric acid. It did lead to a significant amount of acid rain, which has caused damage environmentally throughout Ontario and throughout the world. And as most of the ores are impure, you have to add another material to it to get the slag, which is now another huge issue to store and maintain the slag so that it doesn't generate additional metals leaching into the groundwater and into your local rivers and lakes. So this is really old technology. We're coming on things that are over 100 years old in terms of processing the nickel. It's also highly costly, as well as environmentally costly with a high carbon input. So our bioleaching, conversely, it's a totally natural process. This happens every day, everywhere, all over the world, where naturally occurring bacteria will digest sulfides, iron, just like on your car when you get a rust spot. That's bioleaching in progress with bacteria converting the iron to an iron oxide. We're using the same thing, but what we're doing is accelerating the process. So we crush it and stack it, and then you can put a mildly acidic solution with these bugs in it, and they really prefer this acid to start attacking the sulfides and extracting the metals. And really this process does not involve any releasing of sulfur dioxide. It is a very nice contained process, and we're really just improving how well the bacteria interact with it. And we're seeing some great results with our W4. All it needs is air that we pump into it, some water with a little bit of sulfuric acid to make it a pH of about 2 to 3, and then nutrients, which would include some nitrogen and the sulfides that were in our concentrates. And really what we're doing at EV Nickel, which is innovative, is that we're coming up with a recipe of the amount of nickel and sulfur in our concentrates that will then almost be an equilibrium process, which won't require us to add much additional acid to keep the process rolling forward. Here's your typical smelting refining process that they do down in Sudbury, Ontario, and throughout the world. So you can see here, very typical. They mine it, they crush it, they send it through flotation circuit, which really just separates the sulfides from your barren minerals such as quartz or feldspar or serpentine. They put it through a smelter, that's that flash smelter, and then they put it through a refinery, which then removes further impurities from the nickel matte. You can see in these flow charts, Glencore itself, they will mine and crush and float the ore up in Raglan, but then they put it on a boat, ship it all the way to Montreal, put it on a train, ship it all the way to Sudbury, put it through their smelter, and then put it back on a train, back on a boat over to Norway for final processing and refining. Similarly, for their projects in Sudbury themselves, they go to the Strathcona mill, significant road haulage distance, off to the smelter, and then off to Norway. Vale, very similar. Their mill's a little closer to the large mine than the Falcon or than the Glencore mill, but still, they have to truck it all. They put it on rail or truck, put it through the smelter, and then they send it either to their nickel refinery in Sudbury or ship some of the concentrates off to Wales to process to capture further nickel and copper as well as the PGs. So it's a very carbon intensive process. I think you're on mute, Sean.
I think COVID would have taught me that. So this technology, which is typically done now, has been around, as you said, since the 19th century. That's one part of it. It's an old technology. Plus, they have making use of these assets spread around the world from sort of an era when transport didn't necessarily matter. So it's not just a commercial and economic extra cost, but also now, as we're getting serious about carbon, and a big environmental cost, the difference between sort of what they were doing and then what we have in mind.
Yes. And then this is, if we take a look now at our bioleaching, proposed bioleaching circuit, the front end is very similar. You mine it the way that you normally would. We're going to use electric equipment, which is going to really reduce our carbon footprint. You crush it, you grind it, you float it, and we make this concentrate, that recipe of sulfur and nickel with our ores, and then we put it into these reactor tanks, which is where you mix in the concentrates with your with your bacteria, and you start the extraction process. And we're looking at this extraction process happening in a limited time frame of hours to days, not months to years. What happens is you end up with really two products. You have a liquor, which is pregnant with your nickel, your cobalt, your copper, and then you also have the residual materials that don't get taken up by the bacteria and are left. And really that would be your serpentine, some iron, some magnetite. And so you're not really increasing the volume, you're decreasing the volume of your waste products produced through this bioleaching process. Once we have this liquor, we put it through our metals recovery plant, and you have to remove some of the lower value metals, which can eventually maybe become a sellable product, but at this stage we refer to them as just a product that we're generating that isn't of a value currently. Iron removal, and this is all a function of pH. As you change the pH, the different metals fall out of solution, and we get these nice products that are coming out. We actually, first time, I got very excited. I was holding actual mixed hydroxide precipitates from W4, and I've been working in bioleaching now for about, 15 years. And it's the first time I've held a product that's actually come from one of our projects. But you precipitate that. We have some further impurities removal, and then another stage we're adding is this magnesium hydroxide stage at the end, where we can actually produce a very high quality magnesium hydroxide, which can go into your ceramics, which can go into further carbon capture, which has a lot of other applications, and it's another possible value product produced from this process.
So, Paul, what have we learned? So, where do we stand on this now?
What we've learned is that our W4 deposit is highly amenable to bioleaching. Basically, what we're seeing in our preliminary test results was greater than 90% of the nickel and cobalt were coming out within 7 days, and this is very good. And we've taken measures of the concentrations of your metals throughout the process, and the resulting solutions have been interpreted being ideal for the recovery of nickel and cobalt, and you can see that from that MHP that we've produced. We've also successfully extracted Mg. Preliminary results demonstrate that we're able to get over 99% recovery from the leach solutions of both nickel and cobalt, and over 99%, almost 100% of the magnesium can be precipitated from your pregnant leach solution. So results of the optimization that we've been doing as the next phase have been highly successful. We're developing the flow sheet that's going to be utilized in our continuous pilot plant that we're starting to run now. And as we're moving forward, we've generated about 10, or I should say about 100 kilograms of concentrate that we're going to use in this pilot study. And we look at this starting up anytime now in the next month or two.
Yeah, so it's exciting. Like, we've been hugely successful in the bioleaching, and we're now ready to go to the next phase. So it is working so far, and I realize it's a complicated concept, but it's the sort of thing that is a real game changer. And I really encourage investors to take a closer look, comparing the traditional flow sheet to what we're now proposing. And again, if we continue to have success and we think we could potentially scale this up, it's a big difference. So let's jump over then to the carbon capture. The other big area we released on this today. Paul, do you want to sort of set the stage here?
Sure. Look, basically our carbon capture trajectory is one that is the gold standard for carbon capture. What we're doing is we'd be converting CO2 gas into a very stable, long-lived mineral form that really shouldn't or will not release any of the CO2 back into the atmosphere. It's permanently capturing that CO2 over a geological time scale. Now, what we've, from past studies that they've done in Western Australia and Canada has shown that brucite is really your key mineral for capturing the carbon, and brucite will react naturally with the CO2, forming these carbonate minerals within these ultramafic rocks. And so, we're looking at crushing up these rocks for especially our large scale project. And what you're doing is you're increasing the surface area, which allows you to increase the CO2 uptake during that process, naturally occurring. And what we found is that, as we keep going, it is a function of particle size. And we have two different possible streams. One is a passive stream where you just traditionally pump the tailings out into a pond, you allow CO2 to interact with the tailings and then move forward. The second one is to use a CO2 stream that's enriched in carbon dioxide and pumping it through in some form to accelerate that process. And we have the actual quantitative data from those two tests that we've done on some of our selected samples from our Carlang A deposit. So if we want to move on to the next slide. There we are. So this is the passive testing. This is the one just with the ambient CO2 content within the air. And so basically what we do is we've taken a sample of this, we've ground it into the size powder that we would expect from the tailings, put it into an apparatus, and then we started to pump natural air through it. And really you can see here that over a 21-day period, that material continued to absorb CO2 as projected based upon our estimates of brucite from QuEM-scan analysis and XRD. And so it really was on the trend that you would expect. And this is fairly typical, probably on the upper end of what you would expect to see from these type of deposits in the world. So
now, Paul, that passive is really just like we've shown this sample. This is from the Carlang.
Yes.
And this would be the passive, right? Just exposed to the atmosphere and it naturally forms the crust.
Yeah, that was an outcrop that's been exposed to air for about 10,000 years, and that crust was formed just through CO2 going into it. And it looks like an orange, really, where you have a rind around the outside and the inside would be the darker material.
So this hasn't been exposed much to the atmosphere. This has, and it drew in naturally the CO2. And now we're quantifying what that would look like in the form of what our tailings size would be.
Exactly. Okay, so the next one. Okay, now this is the enriched analysis. And what we did is we pumped a CO2 rich. It had 10% content of CO2 in the gas that we pumped through it. Same sort of process. You measure how much carbon you have before you do it. You measure the amount of carbon you have in it after, and then you can quantify how much was taken up. Now you can see that the brucite samples that we had really just sucked up the CO2 in the first 48 hours. Pumped it right up, getting close to like, 3 to 4% uptake of CO2 into it. So if you had 1,000 kilograms of tailings, it can uptake up to 40 kilograms of CO2 within the first 48 hours. We ran this out over 7 days, and you can see that it kind of started to level out, but it was still taking some up. We saw that it really did react with almost 100% of what we estimate the brucite to be in there, the measured amount. And we see that this is really a great opportunity for us to be able to accelerate that natural process, come up with a transparent and traceable way of storing CO2 so that it's a really nice process and can be an add-on to what we're currently doing at Carlang A.
Mm-hmm. So where does that get us, Paul, based on the most recent feedback from the guys at ARCA?
Well, basically, within the report that they provided us on the results, they said that Carlang A shows significant carbon mineralization potential that will exceed the mine's emissions. So basically, if you see, if we're using electric equipment and everything, it'll be a very low initial carbon footprint. With the CO2 uptake, either passive or enriched, that we're going to be able to have some additional carbon credits from that process and just the amount of CO2 being taken up. Now, we also have done some other surface sampling. We submitted 10 samples to XPS to do some work, some QEM scan analysis to give us an idea how much brucite was contained within those samples. And we saw that every sample had some amount of brucite. They averaged on average somewhere in the 3 to 6% range brucite. And so it really shows that the entire trend has that similar potential to what we've quantified at the Carlang A. So now this will advance towards a pilot phase. We're going to integrate it with our projected larger scale pilot plant for the bioleaching. And we're really excited about the opportunities to take some enriched gases and strip out the CO2 in a very short period of time.
Well, we want to be really clear on this. There are the two different approaches. One is the passive, that we studied and we know what it naturally does. That's the ambient air just hitting the rock and capturing some of the CO2. And then there's the enriched. But we want to be really clear that to be able to go down the path of the enriched, ideally you have a large source of CO2, high CO2 gas nearby. That doesn't currently exist in Timmins, but it does. It potentially exists in Northern Ontario. It also potentially exists that you can be able to build a plant that draws in CO2, intensifies CO2 into gas. We're going to look at lots of different options there, but we want to be really clear with investors between the two streams, between the passive and the enriched, in that they are different approaches and different results as well. So passive is really you scatter your tails, and your big consideration would be how long do you allow those tails to be exposed before the next ones come on top. Over on the enriched, you're doing that, plus you need to source and figure out your ways of constantly being able to pump it in. That's all doable, but we want to be very clear about ensuring we can get our hands on an enriched source of high CO2 gas. Okay, so this pulls it all together, right? And we have presented this slide before. The way that we are thinking about our emissions is around drawing out the baseline eventually of what an operation would look like and what the emissions related to that operation would be. So that's like sort of if we used typical technology, what would the emissions intensity be for producing nickel? And then the way we think about it is each of these components of clean nickel are emission reductions, and we would quantify each of them, do them all with third parties, sort of be able to wrap a bow around each of these improvements, And then once you quantify that drop in the reductions and you set up a program where you're going to be able to continuously monitor and collect the data according to certain standards, if we can pull this all together, that becomes in itself a potential product. So the emission reduction between what a typical mine would look like and what we would build with our potential project, and being able to quantify those differences and be able to monitor and collect data over a longer term, that is exactly where the credits market is. It's a bit of the Wild West in terms of what you get paid. But that is the way we're looking at doing this, is that in addition to a project that could potentially be producing nickel and cobalt, we're potentially producing these emission reductions for credits. Okay, so I've shown that slide before. That's the way we think about the R&D. Wanted to bring investors up to speed in better detail about where we stand and what we've learned. That's where we're at. Kyle, do we have questions that have come in?
Yes, we had some pre-submitted questions via email, but I also see questions in the chat. So let me first touch on the ones we got via email. Where else is this done in the world? Is this something new?
The carbon capture is, it has been studied. The first one that was on the horizon with the potential carbon capture out of mines is Mount Keith in Western Australia. But obviously there are other groups, especially Canadian nickel juniors, that specifically are looking at producing nickel out of brucite intensive ores. So that would include Canada Nickel and others. So there are groups that are looking at it, and there are groups that are ahead of us with production who have quantified, what their benefit is. That's on the carbon capture. On the bioleach, Paul, do you want to talk a bit about where that's at?
Sure. Bioleaching is done for other metals throughout the world, including gold and copper, but there are examples of nickel bioleaching. The most applicable or biggest one is Terrafame in Finland, and basically they are using a heap leach, which is a bit different process for recovering the nickel or for extracting nickel, in that they pile the ore into huge piles and then drip line acid into it, much like a copper SXEW, recovering then the metals out of a similar nickel metals recovery system. Then there also is a plant in West Australia at the Cosmic Boy refinery, which is using bioleaching to treat high arsenic concentrates that they're producing from their mill. And so, this isn't new technology. It's not black box. We're not saying that this stuff has never been successfully integrated into a system. What we're doing is we're just modifying and optimizing it to our deposits in the Timmins area.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I have there's quite a few questions from Maurice, and I'm just going to read it verbatim so I don't miss anything, but please feel free to answer in the best way possible. But on the carbon capture, it's confusing how the companies use different terms. How does this week's news compare to Canada Nickel's November 2021 news, and I quote, 17.5 kilograms of CO2 captured per ton of tailings, end quote. And then in 2022, when they stated, talking about, and I quote, tons of CO2 per ton of nickel after offsetting all emissions, end quote. How do investors make sense of all this?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So it is somewhat confusing. So if we compare to what CNC said, the 2021 number is apples to apples with what we are talking about with our announcement today. So today we were talking about up to 40 kg, and that's in the tailings. So by 2022, because their project had moved along, and they by that point had a mine plan that was in a PEA or a PFS, I'm not sure. But when they had a mine plan, they could then do it as per produced nickel. And then also, I think, Kyle, they were saying the difference from the emissions of the operation. So by that point, they had quantified the emissions to be able to do that math. So long answer to a long question, but 2021 would be apples to apples with what we're presenting today. And that's really what we can say at this point, because we don't yet have a mine plan and production numbers, because that's what you'd get at the PEA stage, which we're not at yet. But I think the 2021 numbers are similar units to what we're talking about today. And that next phase, we'll get there when we're at PEA ourselves. Because I think alongside our PEA, we will also do what is our emissions related to what we're presenting in terms of, that study whenever we get to that next stage.
Thank you. You did a great job at explaining that. From Leon, do you think these carbon capture samples will be representative of the car laying trend? Do you think you'll average 6% brucite?
So Paul, you could talk about the samples we've done and sort of the range of brucite percentages from those samples.
Yes.
But it's important to remember sort of what stage we're at. So I don't think we've done. Well, Paul, you can answer as QP.
Yeah, I don't think we have enough data points to say what the overall area is going to contain in terms of brucite percentage. But what we do see is these samples that are averaging somewhere between 3 to 10% brucite. Mm-hmm. You get some samples that have a lower amount of brucite. You get some samples that have a higher amount of brucite. But on average, yes, we're seeing that the brucite is throughout the entire car laying trend based upon the sampling distribution that we've done. And we do plan on submitting further samples to further define it and determine what the distribution of this brucite would be along the car laying A trend.
Great. Thank you, Paul. We have a direct question about, on the R&D generally, how do you plan to make money on this? Is this a distraction for the company?
Well, not a distraction. So we're doing it because as we go down the path of 43101, right? So we've got a resource now. The eventual next stage would be PEA, and then moving on towards feasibility. Tucking in alongside things like calculating the emissions from your project. It's not yet part of 43101, but you see more and more of it going into those studies. And we're just taking the next step, which is trying to do R&D to minimize that carbon cost, because we hear it loud and clear from the new demand, from the guys who want all this new nickel to come onto the market. They also want the lowest possible carbon cost. So it may seem to your typical mining investors who've been following the space that we're not just talking about mineralization in the ground and our existing resource and racing ahead along the 43101 path. This is the new world we're in, where carbon cost is important and minimizing the carbon cost is important. So I don't think it's a distraction. I think we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And I anticipate that the market will soon be having everybody do it. Maybe we're ahead on that, but really that's the reason we're in this business, is to try to reach that need, the new demand for the lowest possible carbon cost. How do we plan to make money off of it? Is that slide we showed at the end, which I've shown before. The way we think of it is when we get to the point of talking about a mine plan and putting really meat on the bones of a project concept, we look forward to saying, here is the typical way that we would have built this project if we wound back the clock, old technology, doing it the way it was always done, which would have a usual emissions concentration to it, an emissions intensity. And then we'll have these things to bring that emissions intensity down. We'll have studied them. And then if we eventually get to building a project, we would build a project with a much lower emissions intensity. The difference between that baseline and what we would build, that becomes a reduction and potentially can be converted into a credit. So that's the way we're going about it. We think of all of these pieces going into that waterfall chart, and we can tell you all the work we're doing is with that in mind. So that's developing a methodology and ensuring that that waterfall chart is itself auditable and sort of in line with the way the credits market trades. So we think there's a lot of potential emissions credits going down that path. And then we know as well there is a value to be attached to those emissions credits. And I believe Canada Nickel, for example, very similar, analogous project, but importantly, they're all separate. The way the credits market, when you're in the non-regulated credits market, assesses the value of different credits. But they came out and said that they anticipate their credits would be worth $25. So I'll tell you, these paths we're going down could potentially realize a heck of a lot of credits for the Shaw Dome project we have in mind. So that'll become a neat little business. So long answer to the question, but that's the way we think about making money off of it. That's the reason we're doing it. And we think that there's a lot of potential there.
Thanks, Sean. And that ties nicely into the first question in the chat here. Thanks, Sean and Paul. How much of the $2.1 million raised is going to the bioleaching pilot plant phase? Will RPC or Ontario grants be subsidizing? RPC is our subcontractor, similarly to ARCA, and we work with EPCM. So those are the technical groups. Those are the brains. They're not subsidizing it, but we to this point have been about 75 cents of every R&D dollar has been covered by grants from the government. So the pilot plant. We recently submitted an application to a new federal program for which we'll hear about in the first half of next year for a big material multi-year potential funding of that pilot plant. And their call for proposals was sort of directly in line with what we're talking about now, the next stage of continuing to advance a new technology and commercializing it. So we would be looking for potential government subsidies to continue to help fund our R&D, hopefully with a ratio similar to what it's been to this point between the province and the feds. So going forward, and we'll have more news of this, especially I think next year, but going forward with a pilot plant up in Timmins, we would anticipate that we'd have government funding from multiple levels helping fund that. To the start of the question, how much of the 2.1 million, so the most recent financing, is going towards the R&D? Not much. So the R&D spending we anticipate is going to continue to be funded by the levels of government. And really what we're doing with the financing, and that's not really sort of the guidelines of this call, is that we are trying to keep as much close to the vest as we can because we don't know what's happening around the next corner for financing. So R&D spending, we anticipate will continue to be covered significantly by government subsidies. We continue to apply for different programs, and we think a similar ratio to what we've had to date on go-forward R&D funding will continue. And that most recent financing, we're really trying to preserve that and keep it as long as we can, because again, we're not so sure about what's around the next corner. Now, Steve has a question in the chat. Sounds more like an industry specific rather than an EV nickel specific question, but would other producers be able to go the bioleaching route rather than smelting?
Paul?
I would say that definitely, yes, they can. But what we've done is we've developed a head start in really the process and the relationships with the people that make the projects happen. So I would see that once we are continue to be successful in this, and as we advance towards being more of an actual processing technique, that we will have those opportunities to get licensing agreements with other groups. And this really could free up a lot of deposits, let's say further north, that are currently bound due to distance, bound due to lack of infrastructure, that they could actually generate a product that would be avoiding the smelter and the refinery and going straight to the battery producers.
Yeah, so there's two things on that, right? It's on the bugs, importantly, and Paul's explained this before, I don't think necessarily in this call, but the approach that we've taken on the bacteria has been to develop our own bacteria from local samples. So it was all started, Paul, with water samples taken from the Shaw Dome, right?
It was.
So it's a localized bug. We're not buying bugs off the shelf, which is also something out there. So in terms of technology, we obviously own the IP on the bugs that we have bred. So there's that. And then the other consideration is that the bacteria and the recipe, and you've heard Paul mention recipe a couple times, and going forward, that's really what we're trying to confirm on a larger and larger volume, knowing the recipe. So, and you heard Paul mention that today, minimizing how much acid is required. And if you can make it self-sustaining, that's really going to be the neat part. If Paul can crack the recipe with our experts as we go to the next level with more volume coming through, that becomes really interesting. So I would say if that, as Paul says, opens up other assets, and once you figure out how to breed the bugs and figure out the recipe with the variables you've got, it really opens up a whole lot of opportunity.
Great. Before I get to more company specific, I see an engaged attendee asking a question. They said this is actually his top question, so I'm going to address it right now. There's been some fluctuation in the nickel price. How does this impact EV Nickel's current valuation?
Well, there's the short term and the long term, right? If you think about like a telescope, the way Paul and I are planning the business is we've got a telescope, we're looking out a few years. If you flip that thing around and you see what's right in front of you, that's the nickel price. So yes, there are short-term fluctuations in the nickel price, and folks could talk your ear off about what's going to happen between now and January around the nickel price. We're separate that in terms of what we're planning for. But the reality is we're in that world which fluctuates every day with the nickel price, which we think reflects back on the valuation of companies. So we believe the nickel price and us coming as having a softer nickel price environment is likely impacting our stock. And if the flip happens and nickel tears, I suspect a general influx of cash will come to the nickel space. But the way we're planning the business is not around the 2023 nickel price. It's the 2027 nickel price. And again, we didn't talk about the macro today, but I'm pretty bullish in terms of the nickel price for the horizon we're looking at because of this situation with the new demand category and no new supply category. So it seems as though we're in a choppy nickel market. There's all kinds of reasons for that. That's sort of above my pay grade. We're focused on where the nickel price is going to be in 4 years, and building something for that.
Thanks, Sean. And during the presentation, you mentioned the new strategic investors. Steve has a question. Are your new strategic investors committed to help meet future financing needs?
Yeah. So when we announced those in September, there are 2 that we named, and one is an industry participant. So we have 3 new strategic investors. Each of those strategic investors got a few things for their investment. One was a nomination right, meaning that they can choose to nominate a board director if they so choose. So later this year, when we distribute the AGM material, we'll see if they call that right. One of the 3 immediately came out of our board, John Patterson, and we go through his short bio in the news release and on our website. I encourage people to take a closer look at what he's all about. Paul and I have spent a huge amount of time with John and the other strategic investors. And the neat thing is, in addition to the nomination right, there's a participation right. So to the question, have they promised to support? They have a participation right. So they have a certain percentage of all future financings, as long as they continue to hold a certain percentage. And they plan to do that. So they are very involved in the future direction of the company. And I'll tell you, one of the real challenges, and I talked about this on the last 6 call, was doing a financing after our stock had been pounded so much and trying not to reward the people who had helped on the pounding. So turning around and drawing funds from a new pool of investors, two of whom of the three are generalists. So they were drawn in by the value in the story, and tapping into those groups. And those groups also represent a huge network of other similarly inclined groups is really exciting for us running the company. And I'll tell you, having their participation percentage as sort of a head start on future financings is very exciting. So they have committed to support the company. They are very involved in the company right now. And it's night and day between where we stood, for example, at the beginning of the summer, launching a financing, and where we stand now, again, looking forward over the next few years for future financings.
Perfect. Thank you. And Rock has a question in the chat. Have you done a preliminary cost estimate for building the leaching facilities described?
We have in-house numbers, both for pilot plants and then to understand what it would look like as part of a project concept. It's premature for us to be talking about dollars, so we don't want to trigger anything with our disclosure. So we're going to steer clear of talking about how much it would cost. But I'll tell you, we will have future disclosure around investments on this continued R&D when the time comes. And then, of course, this would be included in the next 43-101 studies, which for us, after resource, would be PEA. But premature to talk about dollars at this point. We're really focused on what the results have been.
Definitely. Would you say bioleaching or carbon capture is a greater differentiator for EV nickel? Are competitors also finding brucite in their land packages?
Hey, Paul, do you want to talk about competitors and brucites?
Sure. These ultramafic rocks, all of them generally tend to contain a certain amount of brucite. It all depends upon the alteration sequence that's occurred at that particular site. What I see for our projects in the Shaw Dome is that they appear to have a higher brucite content than the other ones in Western Australia and other projects where I have access to data in Canada. But yeah, everybody is really looking at a similar type of carbon capture process in all of their disclosure that they provided.
So choosing between the two and which one we think is more potential, similar to the last question, because we're not yet talking about dollars, we can't quantify it. But Paul, how do you choose between your two children? Which one is more?
I think that I look at them as two different sort of scale of projects. The bioleaching thing is, I think, something that can be in place within the next few years, because it would dovetail nicely with our W4, and as we advance that project towards a ultimate outcome of generating nickel that goes into the electric batteries. The carbon capture really works when it's on scale. When you have a big scale project, that's when carbon capture really can add a benefit to your project moving forward.
Yeah, and you heard Paul say before his excitement around seeing the MHP, the end product, this thing from the W4 ore, because Paul, you've been at this for a long time, thinking about innovation with the bioleaching. So it is a big deal, but the way to think about it really is as Paul's laid it out, where the bioleaching is a neat sidecar for our high grade track, and then the large scale track has the enormous carbon capture opportunity attached to it. So I kid about choosing between your two children. As anybody with multiple kids knows, they're all our favorites. But we look forward to getting the dollars behind it so we can really begin to show investors what this potential is.
And in terms of capitalizing on the bioleaching tech, the last question in the chat here is just wondering who owns the bioleaching tech? Is there a revenue source from licensing the tech out?
Yeah, so all of our all of us R&D we're talking about in both of the streams, we own the IP. So we got to figure out, how that would potentially be licensed. You've heard us talk about we've gone the specific route for our bacteria on the bioleaching. And then, of course, cracking the nut on the recipe would be ore source specific. But as Paul mentioned, understanding that really puts you ahead for all the other potential ore sources. So importantly, we own the IP, and we hope that we'll have sort of optionality from a technology perspective once we figure it out for our high-grade ores.
Excellent. Great presentation, guys. Great interactive Q&A today. Thank you all that attended and asked questions. If you did tune in late, there is a recording, so it will be available most likely tomorrow that you can watch. Sean, I'll leave it for you for any final words or comments.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. And again, thanks everybody for joining. So we're really excited about this R&D. We did today try to stay in that box and really handhold through the news releases from last week with the bioleaching and today with the carbon capture. It's really exciting, the stuff we've got going on there. More broadly, based on our successful financing out of the summer, we're looking forward to getting back out into the market and telling the story of where EV nickel currently stands, right? As I mentioned, we've got this exploration risk in a way behind us. So we've got a huge amount of mineralization, and we've got optionality from here. We've got the two tracks, the high grade and the large scale. We layer on, of course, this clean nickel R&D. We can do neat, innovative stuff in both of those tracks. In addition, we've got a whole other huge amount of potential for exploration. I say that our exploration risk is behind us, but certainly what's still ahead of us is a huge exploration opportunity across this big land package. So it's an exciting time. One of the most important things from an investor perspective is you can choose any perspective looking at our company and convince yourself that it's undervalued. I know that's a common refrain across the junior market, but really, if you look at what we've got in the ground now, what we've got going on in the R&D, even the value of the clean nickel trademark, plus the exploration potential, I think any of those means that we're an undervalued company trading at 5 million equity value. So I say all that, totally understanding that everybody says the same thing, but I'd encourage investors to dig into a bit more detail, get in touch with us. We can better explain each of these paths. And importantly, stay tuned as we go forward, because we're going to continue to have more and more of this news coming out. Next thing to go in 2023 is more detail around what the project concept looks like as we're beginning to sort of pull those bones together and then put the meat on the bones. But thanks, everybody, and we're always here for more questions.